I'm going to talk to you about the logics of monetary sanctions in the United States. So first, we're starting with some questions. What do you think is the estimated amount of unpaid court debt in the United States right now?
100 million.
100 million. Anything else? Higher, lower?
Low billions.
Low billions. Okay. What about what % of US adults do you think have debt specifically from court costs and legal fees? Percentage of all US adults.
20%.
20%.
50%.
50%. 13, okay, high levels of skepticism, great. Among those with an immediate family member who's in jail or prison, what %, same question as above, what % of US adults do you think have debt from court costs or legal fees?
75.
Okay, all right. And then what do you think about California? Good data on outstanding court debt or not?
They have good data, but they don't share it with research.
Okay.
No.
Great. Here are the answers. 27 billion.
Wow.
That's how much we're dealing with right now. 6% of all US adults have debt specifically from court costs or legal costs. In that group, 20% who, if they have a family member in jail or prison, and shockingly, yes, does have good data. All right, so I just want to give you some context of what we're talking about. This is from the Fines and Fees Justice Center, which is a great nonprofit advocacy group that is doing a lot of good empirical work just on the state of fines and fees and advocacy across the country. And they try to determine how much outstanding debt there is. It was not easy to do. As you can see here, only 11 states actually track full data. Partial data is very dominant and no data coming from many states. I did my work in New York, which you can see is not complete data color. So that was interesting. Just give you a sense of that. So, okay, so what are monetary sanctions? Just to make sure we're all on the same page. Monetary sanctions are the fines, restitution, surcharges, fees, costs. Jurisdictions make up lots of different words to call any financial liability that you get from contact with the criminal legal system. So fines are part of a sentence. A judge issues them to be punitive. That's the idea. It's either, the original idea was either go to jail or pay a fine. Restitution is when there's identifiable victim. And so the person who committed the offense is compensating that victim for a quantifiable amount of harm. So like, I graffitied your fence, I'm paying you to repaint it. I assaulted you, I'm paying your medical bills. That's restitution. And then fees is kind of everything else. And as I mentioned before, all types of words are used to describe what fees are. And one of the key takeaways about fees is that any jurisdiction and any entity in the criminal legal system can create its own fees. So jails have fees, sheriffs have fees, probation officers have fees, courts have fees, clerk can make fees. Like any entity can create fees. They are regularly imposed for every level of offense. So everything from jaywalking and infraction to murder and literally everything in between, they are assessed for that. They vary significantly by jurisdiction. That will be one of the themes of today's talk. And as I mentioned, they can be initiated by any entity. So the legislature, of course, makes laws that governs fines and fees, but also law enforcement, correctional facilities, supervision agencies. And non-payment of all these things that you owe make a lot of bad things happen in both the criminal world and the civil world. The overarching context here is that there is no single policy governing fines and fees in this country. It's very idiosyncratic. It's almost incoherent if you're looking for like stable patterns. But what we are trying to do in this project is get a sense of like how they are used. So I'm reporting today on what is technically called the multi-state study of monetary sanctions with these 8 states. I was the PI for New York, even though I now live in Washington and spend a lot of time in California. These are my co-PIs. They're awesome, without whom none of this work would be possible. And yeah, so you might recognize some names. So those are the people I worked with on this project. 5-year project, getting lots of data. So I want to give you a sense of what data we're talking about. So 8 states, in each state, we had at least 3 jurisdictions. So for example, in New York, we had 2 downstate, so urban jurisdictions, and then upstate, 2 other counties. And then within each county, there's different levels of court, so like misdemeanor, felony. And then in New York, there's a very special thing called town and village courts, where the sitting judge does not have to have a legal license, does not have to have gone to law school, and about 70%, 60% of them do not have, yes, I see your eyeballs above your masks. Yes, so I also looked at some town and village courts in New York. But in all of our 8 states, we had at least 3 jurisdictions, and it was usually like 3, 4, 5 jurisdictions. We started this with a systematic analysis of the statutes. So we very laboriously went through all of the statutes that we could find that related to monetary sanctions, read them, coded them, tried to tabulate them. I'll report on that soon. And then we had a lot of interviews. So we interviewed people who owed money to the courts. We interviewed 510 of them across all of our 8 states. And then we interviewed more than 400 people who work in the court. So that included judges, defense attorneys, prosecutors, clerks, and probation officers. Except in some states like New York, where probation officers would not talk to us and prosecutors would not talk to us. And that varied across states, like who would actually talk to you. We also sat in court more than 200 hours in each of these jurisdictions. So we had about 1,600 hours of ethnographic observation. In case anybody's unfamiliar with what that entails, ethnography, you're sitting, you're watching what's happening, and you're taking very copious detailed notes, which we then transcribed and coded just like you would code interview transcription. So the same idea. So you're kind of like live reporting to yourself for further analysis what you're observing in real time. So we have many, many hours of that. These are our guiding research questions. So one, just basically, what are the logics of monetary sanction use in the US? And then what risks do these monetary sanction systems impose on people? And how do they respond to those risks? Importantly, this is the first project that is a systematic analysis of the most ubiquitous punishment in the country, meaning we impose monetary sanctions much more than jail, prison, probation, et cetera. So it's a big undertaking. Big deal. All right, so the risk. The first risk that we see in terms of monetary sanctions and court debt meaning unpaid monetary sanctions, is the risk of protracted surveillance and entanglement. Meaning that once somebody has a fine, fee, restitution imposed and they struggle to pay it, it's very hard to get out of that cycle. So you are subjecting yourself to more surveillance, like your probation is extended, you are called back to court, you struggle to pay, your driver's license is suspended, then you get another fine for driving with a suspended license. So this idea of just people being entangled in this system. Second risk is the loss of liberty. So arrest warrants are regularly issued for either failure to pay or failure to appear in court. And many people will not go to court if they know they can't pay, right? And even though being put in jail directly for non-payment is not as very common, what happens is people get a warrant for failure to pay or appear, and maybe that warrant's on a Friday, there's no court till Monday, so they end up sitting in jail because they can't pay. And then what we call civil spillover. So that's when basically something in the criminal legal world spills over to affect your civil life and your civil rights. So civil unpaid debt can result in liens, wage garnishment, tax interception, in some places voting rights. So anything where because you can't pay affects your civil life, we're calling civil spillover. So these are the risks that we're interested in seeing how these logics relate to these risks that people experience. So our research approach. So you saw we have this tremendous amount of data. It was a big project. This paper was designed to try to provide an overview of how monetary sanctions function in this country. So to get to some type of overview required a very kind of complicated and iterative approach. The first thing we did was just to try to identify key dimensions that usefully characterize each state. And we started thinking that this would be the beginning and end of this paper. Like if we could identify some dimensions, we could say, oh, California's here, Missouri's there, Georgia's there, here you go, that's happening in the country. And we found that wasn't quite getting us to where we wanted to go, and that the data basically had a lot more to say than that. It was more complicated than that, but we did start there. So I'll report on some of those dimensions. And then we end up using these dimensions to develop a typology of monetary sanction systems. So that's getting to this logics idea. And then we want to use this typology, this idea of logics, to look at other jurisdictions. Like, as a policy person, I'm all about being practical. So in my ideal world, this paper would provide a route for other jurisdictions to say like, oh, we are more this way or we are more that way. We'd like to be more one or the other. All right, so the dimensions. So remember, we're talking about dimensions, then typology. So dimension 1, just looking at the magnitude of the criminal justice system. So we have our 8 states plus North Carolina, which was in at the very beginning, thinking that just understanding kind of the relative imprint of the criminal legal system on people's lives and on policy would be important context. So that's just dimension 1 right there. Dimension 2 is looking at whether the county or the state dominates, right? So which level of government has more influence on how monetary sanctions are used? We found that states tend to have more influence than counties. So for example, in California, the state legislative code does all of the defining for all monetary sanctions, and it has schedules in the statutes governing fines and fees. In New York, there's state level statutes as well that establish mandatory surcharges, and they also determine the classes of felonies. So within the classes set out in the legislature, then judges make decisions within that. But there's exceptions. So in Washington, counties are very dominant, like they do a lot of the policy and rule writing, interpreting. And then in Illinois, there's kind of a hybrid. So there's state law, but because the revenue goes to the counties have more of a role than they do in other states. That's dimension 2. Dimension 3, statutory discretion. So again, we reviewed all relevant statutes. Many caveats and contingencies, meaning that we thought there's statutes, there's fines and fees. We can count things. We're social scientists. We will count the fines and the fees, and we'll say, California has this many, New York has that many. We'd have a beautiful table, and we would be done. But that's basically impossible, because there are things like, in California, you can't actually separate the fines from the fees. So the statute can be written so they are both kind of smushed together. The revenue cannot be disentangled. In Georgia, the surcharges and fees are taken out of a fine. So the line item number may be the same, but what is feeding that line item number changes. And then in New York, it technically has mandatory surcharges that can be waived. And that is not my understanding of the word mandatory, but that is what happens in New York. So taking all of these types of caveats together, we tried to make a table. And you can see there's so many squiggles and asterisks and question marks and ranges and words. There's a lot of things that aren't just numbers in that table, but this is showing you this is the closest we could get. My takeaway from this table is kind of just underscoring one of the key themes is there is no one policy. There's not even one definition to say well, we count the fees. Well, you can't count the fees because in some states those are together with fines. In some states those are mandatory. In some states there's a restitution fee. So is that a restitution or is that a fee? So basically there's no prevailing clear logic, but this table shows you just the variability across jurisdictions.
So these are the number of statutes?
That was the idea.
So California loves the statutes?
Yes, loves the statutes. Lots and lots of statutes. California stood out because not only do they have lots of statutes, but the fines and fees statutes were across many different parts of the law. So not just in the criminal code, but going into all the other sections. I'm not a lawyer, but going to the other sections of the law. But the idea was that this would tell you, California has 408 mandatory surcharges, whereas Illinois only has 34, and that the rest of the table would be that clean and simple. But that is basically impossible. Okay, so dimension 4. We found that looking at judicial discretion, we found that 4 factors determine the role of discretion. Basically, the category of the monetary sanctions, so for example, with moving violations or some drug offenses that remove judicial discretion. If you get to a certain type of traffic offense, it's a mandatory fine at a certain level. Or if you get to a certain type of drug offense, there's a mandatory fee that the judge has no influence over. The nature of the offense, felony, misdemeanor, and then the nature of the offense. The court actor, it depends on the jurisdiction, but sometimes clerks have a lot of discretion, and judges, they always have some discretion, but the amount of discretion a clerk had or a probation officer had on very important things like should this person go to jail, should their probation be extended, that differs, and then of course the jurisdiction. So judges do have the most discretion, but clerks and probation officers have significant authority over payment and consequences in some places. So for example, in Georgia and New York, judges have discretion over fines, but they have little discretion over restitution or fees and surcharges, and clerks have almost no role. But in Illinois, New York, and Washington, the type of judicial discretion is mostly over consequences for non-payment. So as opposed to like, you're going to get this amount, you have this much to pay, time to pay. If you don't pay, then judges have a lot of discretion. So this is the kind of tidy table we wanted before, but this is just summarizing where each of our 8 states stand on that dimension of judicial discretion. And again, we thought that the paper was kind of be like this, like here's your dimension, here are all the 8 states, the end. But you'll see that there's a lot more to be said. So moving from dimensions to archetypes, also known as logics. We took those 4 dimensions, they're the ones I just went over on the left column, looking at the substance of those dimensions. And in the paper, we go into more detail, kind of explaining these dimensions and how they relate to each other. And from that, we build this idea of the logics of monetary sanction systems. So there's 2 logics that I'll be spending the rest of the time talking about. One is this machine logic, where the emphasis is on maximizing the extraction of money from anybody who comes through the court system, versus journey logic, where the focus is on holding people accountable as they navigate towards an outcome that at least ostensibly both they and the legal system find positive and desirable. I will be talking about these 2 logics, machine and journey, going over those characteristics. So this is just giving you kind of a map of where we're headed. So don't try to take all this into your eyeballs right now. But this is laying out the differences on those 2 logics side by side. Okay, so first one is focus. So what is the difference in focus in these 2 logics? So on the left, you see in the machine world, it's very revenue oriented. So we have quotes like, so I should say that we pulled out close to exemplify these logics, meaning that we found robust evidence for all of these logics in our data, like many, many, many instances. But this presentation is pulling out ones that like kind of perfectly encapsulate the idea. But there's a lot behind these that I pulled out. Okay, so in the revenue-oriented world, we have things like a judge in New York saying, if you owe $1,500, well, we're going to set bail at $1,500, right? So if somebody comes in, they owe money, they haven't paid, what they owe is $1,500. The judge is saying, okay, well, you want to get out of jail right now. Bail now all of a sudden is what you owe the courts. And so you can see the logic there is just like, we got to get this money in, right? In contrast, you see the person-oriented. This judge in California is talking about a person named Jane, it's just a generic name. So I'll let Jane pay $25 a month. I'll talk to Jane and ask her when she's getting paid, because the odds of her being out of money are pretty high. Then I'll set a payment plan for Jane, working with Jane, making sure that if she needs an extra shift, she can get it in time. So you can see this contrast about, I'm going to set bail to get this money out of you, versus let me talk to Jane and see what she needs and see what her timing is, right? So that's 2 different types of logic. So that was the focus of the logics. This is individual identity. So in the machine world, we see people speaking in terms that makes it seem like they see themselves as a cog in the machine, right? So the bottom quote here, a judge in New York saying, I'm kind of hamstringed, I just collect stuff for New York State. Like, I don't have individual agency, I'm just a collector. The quote above that from Missouri, I think this is a probation officer talking about how people kind of cycle through the counties in Missouri, which is kind of notorious. So they have a broken taillight, they run through this one road, which has 4 different municipalities, like this one road runs through 4 municipalities. They'll shuffle you, so the people will physically be taken from one jail to the next as they try to pay off what they owe. So in both of those cases, people feel like they're kind of a cog in this revenue machine. In contrast, we have this idea of the rehabilitant. So a judge in California saying, if I see a person who has a drug problem and it's a long-standing drug problem and they're unemployed, I'm not going to hit them with a big fine, right? It's just a waste of time and it puts additional pressure on them. I'll impose the minimum or suspend it altogether. So seeing that this person, this as a person who can perhaps grow or change or could benefit from getting a break, difference in between COG and rehabilitant. Looking at the difference in the rationale of the court's authority. So this is very clearly anchored in kind of those guiding dimensions that we started with. So looking at where the court authority comes from. So in the machine world, it comes from the law. So the law says an offender who defaults will pay this amount. The judge at the bottom is saying that, but the way the law is, fees can only be waived on extraordinary circumstances. So where the authority of the court comes from is written in the law in this machine logic. In contrast, the authority of the court is coming from the relationships that are happening within the courtroom in this journey logic. So a person who owes money in Georgia is saying, my probation officer texts me, calls me, says I need you to come report. I go report, explaining that that they can't pay and that they don't want to sit in jail, and so figuring out how to come up with the money. So again, this is just centering the relationship between the person who owes and their probation officer versus what's just written in the law. So that was rationale of court authority. And so now looking at the locus of institutional discretion. So looking at these institutions involved, where is the discretion most oriented? And so we see in machine logic, it's oriented more in the legislature. So again, a judge saying I have no control over the surcharge that comes from the legislature. Saying that twice, two different judges. And then in contrast, in the journey logic, the courts are the locus of institutional discretion. And so this is a probation officer in Georgia saying, basically explain all of our judges know that that's not something we do. That's just not what we do here. There's typically a reason why, but we're going to do our best to work with them and get that converted and help them out. So trying to ask the question of where does the authority over these fines and fees most lie? In one, legislature, and in the other, the courts. Okay, we're about halfway done. Then looking at the locus of payment discretion. So who gets to say what about the actual details of how payments are made? In the machine world, it's the judge or the clerk. So in this was a person in Missouri saying I would like to get in front of the judge and see if he would amend it. Just pointing out that the judge has the power. Below that, a judge in Georgia saying basically it's all my discretion. I'm the one who sets what the fines are. And then a judge in New York saying you want to pay a fine or spend another night in jail. I give them the choice. So again, it's just centered on the judge making decisions. Versus in journey logic, it's a whole working group. And these I think these are some of the more interesting quotes. Of course, I'm the social scientist who likes these things. But so on the first one, they say that they'll negotiate something with the defense attorney, and that's part of the plea agreement. So that means it involves the prosecutor, and they'll pay something, but for less jail time. And then it's up to the court, meaning the judge, and then it becomes part of probation. So this person is mentioning both attorneys, the judge, and probation in terms of how a decision is made. And then the one after that is, I believe this is a clerk explaining, this is a prosecutor explaining that they would work with a defense attorney to determine the right amount, which is a very different dynamic, right? This is courtroom saying we'll work together to figure it out, than it's just the judge deciding on their own. Okay, so where's the focus of attention? Machine world, unsurprisingly, it's on payment. So this person is saying, I think it's ridiculous I was assessed that amount of money. They know I was selling drugs. How do you want me to pay what I owe? Implying pay more drugs. That they have to support 2 kids with no partner, and you want me to pay $360,000. I think that's ridiculous. And the chief in Calhoun said the same thing, that it was ridiculous. In contrast, looking at the idea of personal progress being the focus of attention. So on the one, we just got to get this money out of you. On the second one, looking at a clerk saying that people in the work group are more concerned about whether the defendants are doing their programs, getting treatment, coming to court, staying out of trouble, that kind of stuff. And then we have the difference in the logic of case processing. So in the one-handed machine world, it's all about efficiency. So this judge in California is saying, I don't actually probe too much. The main function of the court is to be efficient. We just have to move cases along. And then this is a probation officer in Missouri saying if they don't pay up to show those fines, they show up in court, they're going to lose driving privileges, and then it just mushrooms, and they pick up multiple other revocations and issues. And then we see people come on to supervision for driving with a suspended license. And that's the cycle, most important, this person says, that is really uncomfortable from this point of view. So seeing that this lack of efficiency and see people go through this cycle is uncomfortable as a probation officer. In contrast, in the journey world, we are concerned about effectiveness. So this is where the court is faced with having to weigh the good of the community over and against the ability of the offender to pay. So just different orientations, like getting people through versus let's think about what's actually happening with our decisions. Then we have priority. So what's the priority? On the one hand, the priority is on maximizing compliance. Like, how do we get this person to do what we want them to do? This is a person saying, like, I was paying $30 a month on parole, and the parole officer came and said that's not enough. They need $200 a month, and he was like, I can't pay that much. I only make $750. And the parole officer said, well, go pick up cans. And he's like, okay, I will. So the priority is like, how do you get this person to comply? Versus in the journey world, you want to minimize deferral. So basically, you want to minimize the cycle and keeping people coming back over and over again. And so saying right out of the gate, you don't want to set somebody up to fail, right? You want to have some consequences for the poor conduct, but you want to do it in a way that they can, and set up something they can actually achieve. And then the last one is strategy. So in the machine world, like, how do you achieve these ends? In the machine world, you use punitive responses. So in Illinois, we have I think this is a judge saying, well, good luck to you. You may end up in jail if you can't pay. Georgia person who owes money saying, you know, right now, if I was going to ask, I would say I can't do it, which is unfair. You're locking me up for not paying, but I can't pay, basically. So feeling like the harshness of the punitive response. Whereas in journey world, you have this idea that, again, the courtroom working group is working with the person to help maximize their success. So here, you still have the threat of punishment, but you also have this sense of rewards and like working with the person. So this is a probation officer in Georgia saying, you know, that basically telling people not to lose contact with the court. So if the judge says, like, why isn't this person Hector not paying? I say, I don't know, that's not gonna look good. The judge is gonna say, go find out. So if I say, Joe's got this going on, he's paying what he can, he's paying $5 a month, if he's making his payments, he's trying, then the judge tends to look on it more fairly. It's showing that he's somebody who's trying, somebody who wants to be on probation and who doesn't want to be in jail. So the strategy, again, like jail and probation are punishments, but you're working with the person to try to minimize that harm. Okay, so the idea was to look at all of those characteristics and then see how they relate to those risks that I set out at the beginning. So one being legal consequences for non-payment. So in our data, we found all of these things. Warrants happen, arrest happens, jail time, cases go on and on for a long time, probation is extended. We definitely found the world of civil spillover, so all of those consequences that I mentioned. And what we found in our data is that not only do these civil spillovers happen, but they're often very interconnected, and that helps keep people ensnared in both the criminal and civil legal systems. We found evidence of prolonged entanglement, so people telling us and everybody who worked in the courts and people who owed money to the courts, the probation was indeed either revoked or extended for non-payment. And then I think it's important to always hear from the people as well. And so here's some quotes just showing you these risks. So a California attorney saying, because of the debt, they end up cycling right back to the criminal justice system. A Missouri defendant saying that they were going to send me to prison, but they just extended it for one more year. This Illinois defendant encapsulates what we saw over and over and over and over and over and over again, explaining basically what it's like to be impoverished, have these different obligations that they need to pay, like food, shelter, transportation, and how difficult having this criminal legal debt makes it to do those basic achieve those basic costs of living. So then this person's also saying that they had to go to this women's group and had to pay for that as well. So I think it's just this is a really good quote. This person is getting a Social Security check, having to pay rent, having to pay their phone bill, having to pay utilities, needing toiletries, needing the basics, and then having this criminal legal debt. And so we just found this very consistently across our data that people struggle to afford the basic necessities like food, shelter, transportation. we asked people directly, people who owed money to the courts, about their sense of fairness of the system. And so this Missouri defendant is kind of echoing this accountability narrative that we hear a lot, saying, I did it. I think it's fair. I committed the crime. I knowingly did it. So yeah, I think it's fair. In contrast, you have this Georgia defendant saying, I don't think it's fair because I don't have any other way to pay, right? So you're locking me up for not paying you, and I don't have a way to pay, and that's not fair. Like, why would you do that? California defendant saying, I think it's tough, like in some ways it's fair. Previous in this quote, some ways it's fair, but though it's not fair is having to both go to jail and pay. So that was a very common refrain too. People feel they would use words like double jeopardy, double punishment, getting punished twice, and this is very common. Like people definitely had both jail time and having to pay. So policy school, policy person, I need to end with some policy recommendations. So this is based on this research and then some other research that I've done independently outside of this project. But one of the basic findings is that if you simply extend the amount of time people have before what they owe becomes delinquent, like before you trigger all the bad things, that can make a huge difference. Because in some jurisdictions, it can be as short as like 15 days, 30 days. And if you are a person who's precariously employed or housing insecure, it could just so happen that 30-day window, you need the money for something else, very important, right? And so even just extending it to 60, 90, 120 days, like talking about months until the bad things get triggered, can really be very impactful for people. Absolutely reducing the use of driver's license sanctions for non-payment. And there's a lot of advocacy happening in the policy and legal world on this front. This is really important because it is one of the direct ways in which people get sucked into the criminal legal system, and then the penalties start to escalate because once you start driving on a suspended license, that can be a higher level offense with more and more money and potential for jail time. So to avoid that, here's some policy ideas. So you could start by just limiting what types of offenses you sanction licenses with. So as opposed to all infractions and misdemeanors, maybe it's just felonies that you do anything with license whatsoever. Easing the process of obtaining a restricted license so people can drive to work, because one of the fundamental lacks of logic I see is taking away somebody's license so they can't legally drive to work to get the money to pay the thing. So if you just make it easier, but I think most states have a way to do that, but it's very convoluted and complicated. So if there was an easier way for people, like perhaps when they're sentenced, say, but here's a way to get a restricted license, that could be very helpful. Simply setting a higher minimum amount of unpaid debt to trigger anything happening to your license. Again, if you lose your license over not paying $20, which absolutely can happen, maybe that's not the best policy idea in terms of efficiency, versus if you now owe $10,000. Like, okay, that's pretty serious. Let's start to think about other sanctions. And then having something called a relicensing day, which is based on this other project that I've been working on amnesty, which is when courts have a day, a week, where people come in and have their debt forgiven or reduced. So doing something like that, where you have a day that's all about restoring people's driver's licenses, where they can come in and figure it out in one day. And then simply providing more information to people who have court debt. People are often deeply confused about what they owe. I think it's mostly because they owe it to so many different entities at once. So just in the criminal legal system, they might owe fines and fees and probation something and restitution, but then they also probably might have child support or credit card debt or medical bills. So people are often in this world of owing lots of money, and so for the court system to explain what they owe and then what happens if they don't pay it, a lot of people don't understand that jail is a problem. That jail is a risk that they face. So explaining that could be very helpful. And then expanding or supporting financial counseling, again, like the idea of providing people with information. And then preemptive cancellation of uncollectible debt. So this is like the big topic that I think has not been very much explored, and I'm trying to now start to explore it, which is in the world of policy, you have practitioners say, well, we need this money for XYZ. Like, this is how we fund the courts. This is how we fund the crime victims fund. The issue is that we are talking about basically uncollectible debt. So that is largely imaginary money. It's just like credit card debt. It goes stale. If you don't collect it in the first year or two, the chances of you collecting it just drop off exponentially, right? And so doing something where the courts are more tethered to the reality of like the collectability of the debt they're imposing, and doing something preemptive could save a lot of time and money. Okay. Anybody want to guess who said this? Reasons for taking people's property always exist, and once started down this path, there is no stopping. Close. Machiavelli. And with that, I will end. Thank you.